Welcome to the series I'm calling a little bit tongue-in-cheek Sciencing, intended to help you to better understand scientific research and, in this module especially, to help you read scientific research. We're going to look at the structure, or what I call the anatomy, of a primary research paper. So primary research is original work. Secondary research is reviews of original work, as a rule of thumb. So some of the details will vary in terms of the structure or the anatomy from journal to journal, maybe even a little bit from discipline to discipline, but these slight differences aren't going to matter very much. What you learn watching this will be broadly applicable. So there is enough similarity between disciplines and research approaches and journals to have this be a good starting point. When you do a search, for example, on PubMed or Google Scholar or some other database, if you're at a university, for example, the first thing you'll see about an article is the title and its authors. The first question then becomes, is this likely to be relevant to my inquiry, my question, and my broader context that I have around asking that question or making that inquiry? Assuming that it is, you'll want to get yourself a copy of the full paper, which will hopefully be available to you electronically. When you do, you'll see that the title and the authors are also among the first things on the electronic or paper version of the article. Next, you'll probably see the abstract. This is a summary of key findings about the study. If the title wasn't enough to let you decide on the relevance of the study to your inquiry, to your question, or your context, then the abstract usually will provide enough information. If you do decide the study is worth reading, you'll need to go beyond the abstract, as this is often lacking crucial detail, and also being the first thing people read after the title, the abstract is usually written to make the study look as good as possible. It's a bit of a sales pitch. It's intended to make you want to read the study, it's intended to make the study look interesting, and it's intended to emphasize what the authors believe. So make sure you look at the detail of what happened, so the methods, and what was found, the results. Next, you'll come across the introduction. This is like a mini literature review. A good introduction will tell you why the research that follows was justified, as in why it was important to do. In this case, it was justified because the condition of interest is very common and having it puts people at risk of a range of health problems. Additionally, there wasn't much previous research in this area. So those are common justifications, but there are many others. The other thing the introduction usually does is give you the aim or aims of the study. In other words, what the study set out to investigate, what questions it set out to answer or at least address. Then you'll probably get to the methods section. Occasionally it's not in this order, but most of the time it is. This is the number one section to read. In fact, for the sake of efficiency, once I've decided a paper is of interest based on its title, maybe also its abstract, then I often only read the methods and results sections. The methods section should tell you what was done, how it was done, and assuming the study involved human participants, who it was done with. And even if it didn't involve human participants, if it involved animals or cells, it will also tell you that. This means that this section lets you decide whether the study is likely to be any good or of relevance and of use. Beyond that, what the methods section does or even should tell you depends on the type of study you're reading. For now, be aware that it's the methods section that will tell you about the population the study focused on, assuming again the research was done in human participants. Why is that important? Because if you are working with a particular group that have a particular condition, then you mostly want to rely on research that look at that group. Not the individuals you're working with, but people at least with the same condition. This section, the methods section, should also name or at least describe the qualitative methodology or the quantitative study design used for the study. And it should say what data were collected, the methods used to collect that data, and how the data were analyzed. All of these need to be assessed with a critical eye to determine whether it's even worth reading the results. Statisticians have a saying, or an acronym, GIGO, GIGO, which stands for garbage in, garbage out. If the methods are not good, if a question has been asked poorly, or rather the answer to a question has been collected poorly, then the results really aren't worth reading. That's why I read the methods section first. If the methods are poor, the results might easily be wrong. So, as you go through the method section, you have to decide, is this an appropriate study methodology or design? Is it in a relevant population or relevant populations for your context, your purposes, what you want to know? Are the methods appropriate? And is the analysis appropriate? Now, if any of these get crosses, it may very well not be worth proceeding on to the results section. And you should certainly ignore the conclusions. You can read the results section. If the context is right and you feel confident, you can decipher this even if you get the odd cross, but certainly make up your own mind about what those results mean. Now, assuming you give the method section the all clear, you'll probably get to the results section. And sometimes this is also called the findings. Here you should find information about the study's sample. The sample is different to the population. The population refers to everyone who would have been eligible to take part, whereas the sample refers to the study's actual participants. The question then becomes, is the sample consistent with your inquiry, with your question? Does the sample represent, let's say, the age, sex, or other characteristics relevant to your context? The results section will, of course, contain numerical results and perhaps graphs or similar in the case of quantitative research. If the research is qualitative, the findings section might contain quotes of interviewees, pictures, illustrations, or similar. We would hope that the results section is quite objective and that it faithfully represents the data collected in the study. But even if it is, we still need to look at the results of any single study in the context of closely related research, assuming there is any. And also, we need to consider, are the results consistent with what you could reasonably expect based on prior knowledge? Keep in mind that even if the answer to one or both of these is no, it doesn't mean the study is wrong. It just means we should think long and hard about what might explain such a scenario, such a difference. It could be that our study or studies we're comparing to are actually wrong, and this one's right. But it does mean we need to think a little bit more deeply. Usually there is a discussion section after the results. This essentially combines a miniature literature review with further discussion of the results themselves. The purpose of the discussion section is to place the study in the broader context of previously published research. Does it agree or align with previous work, or does it contradict previous research? And if so, why? This section is useful if you are new to an area and need additional context. Always bear in mind, though, that the discussion section tells a story, and that story may not be very objective. It may be, but there is no guarantee. Authors may, for example, have deliberately selected only reference research consistent with their findings and left out contradictory research. The discussion section is also where you should find some mention of the study's limitations. Again, bear in mind the authors don't want to make their study look too bad, so never rely on this section to evaluate a study. By all means, look at the limitations they have mentioned. They may know some limitations that are very specific to their field that you as a more novice reader do not. but do not end your consideration of limitations at what the authors have to say. Do think about what you know about study design, what you're learning, and anything else that pops up that makes you think, oh, well, there were some issues with the study. No study is perfect. That's not the issue. But we want to see how good a study is for the purpose we're putting it to, like answering a specific question we have. Make up your own mind based on what you've read in the methods section. Often, the study's conclusion is the last paragraph of the discussion section. Other times, it's its own small section. Either way, the conclusion amounts to little more than the author's opinion, which may or may not be highly biased. Come up with your own conclusion based on your assessment of the quality of the methods and what you read in the results section. There is no accounting for outright fraud. You can't tell if someone made up some numbers, but you absolutely can form your own opinion on the assumption that the results were honestly reported and the methods were honestly reported. And even if they were, it doesn't mean that necessarily you would agree with the conclusion of the authors, so skip that part. I know it's incredibly tempting to go only to that. That's what press releases are often all about, but it's actually if you had to avoid any one part, I would avoid the conclusions. Come up with your own. Other important sections include sections that discuss funding and other acknowledgements of support, and these are often at the end of a paper, just before the references. However, headings are not very consistent across different journals for these specific things. Nonetheless, this information is important because it helps you to check for any apparent conflicts of interest, for example. Last in the majority of papers is the reference list. This is a great place to find related articles, especially if the reference you're looking at is relatively new. It also allows you to find any articles you think may not have been correctly summarized by the authors, so you can double check. Now, this is unlikely unless you have some familiarity with those papers anyway, and you just want to verify, because why else would you think something was misquoted? But absolutely, if you do enough of this checking, you will find that references are indeed misquoted. Simply because someone can reference a statement doesn't necessarily mean that the reference supports what they are saying. Now, if you found this useful, hit like, subscribe, and most importantly, keep learning by watching other modules in the series, for example, this one or this one.